Good evening. Welcome to this evening's event, Mary Church Terrell, the Face of African-American Women's Suffrage Activism with Professor Allison Parker. The Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African-American Studies is proud to co-sponsor this event with the Susan B. Anthony Institute of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, alongside the Black Alumni Network and the Women's Network, in partnership with Susan B. Anthony Center and the Paul J. Burgett Intercultural Center and Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence. I would also want to say thank you to our captioners and interpreters who are helping ensure that this program is accessible. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping things. Might be helpful Zoom tips for you out there in the virtual world. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it anytime through the Q&A function that is located at the bottom of the screen. Today's event articulates an important part of the study of Black life and Black struggle, the role of intersectionality, particularly being Black and woman in history and our present. As a Black feminist thinker and doer, the importance of Mary Church Terrell as a visionary, educator, and activist within and outside Black communities cannot be overstated. I remember reading a speech she delivered in 1908, a significant year for many of you out there, where she stated that, quote, "The incomparable Frederick Douglass did many things of which I, as a member of that race, which he served so faithfully, am well proud. But there is nothing he ever did in his long and brilliant career in which I take keener pleasure and greater pride than I do in his ardent advocacy of equal political rights for women and the effective service he rendered to the cause of women's suffrage." Let us never forget that one of the forefathers of Black studies was indeed a feminist. And today's lecture and its partnership is a key reminder that this legacy yet remains. Today, we will hear more about the esteemed Mary Church Terrell from Professor Allison Parker. Allison M. Parker is History Department Chair and Richards Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. She has research and teaching interests at the intersections of gender, race, disability, citizenship, and the law in US history. Allison Parker is the author of two books, Articulating Rights, 19th Century American Women on Race, Reform, and the State, and the book from which her talk is drawn today, Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell. As director of the Frederick Douglass Institute of African and African-American Studies, I am glad to introduce Professor Allison Parker.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Let me work on sharing my screen. Okay. Hello. I want to start just by thanking John Cullen, Jessica Guzman-Ray for inviting me, and Caroline Tolbert for organizing this event, along with all the many co-sponsors. What I'd like to talk with you about today is Black women's suffrage activism through the life and activism of the feminist, suffragist, and civil rights activist Mary Church Terrell. Terrell is best known as the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, or NACW, in 1896, and as a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909. She was the first Black woman to graduate with a bachelor's and a master's degree from a predominantly white college, Oberlin College, and she then taught at the nation's best segregated public school, the M Street High School in Washington, D.C., and was then appointed as the first Black woman on its Board of Education. Terrell had first publicly expressed her support for women's suffrage at the National Council of Women's Convention in 1891. The first large suffrage meeting which I attended was the one in Washington, at which women who were interested in the subject were present from all over the world. Among the women sitting on the platform that meeting were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Miss Anthony. The presiding officer requested that all those to rise who believed that women should have the franchise. Although the theater was well filled at the time, comparatively few rose. I was among the number who did. I forced myself to stand up, although it was hard for me to do so. In the early 1890s, it required a great deal of courage for a woman publicly to acknowledge before an audience that she believed in suffrage for her sex when she knew the majority did not. Terrell's description of the reticence of women who had chosen to attend a major women's convention suggests that a pro-suffrage position in the 1890s was still a daring radical stance. Having attended a convention of the newly merged National American Women's Suffrage Association, referred to as NACW, Terrell later recalled, "When the members of the association were registering their protest against a certain injustice, I arose and said, as a colored woman, I hope this association will include in the resolution the injustices of various kinds of which colored people are the victims." "Are you a member of this association?" Miss Susan B. Anthony asked. "No, I am not," I replied, "but I thought you might be willing to listen to a plea for justice by an outsider." Then Miss Anthony invited me to come forward, write out the resolution, which I wished incorporated with the others, and hand it to the Committee on Resolutions. And thus began a delightful, helpful friendship. Anthony subsequently invited Terrell to speak to the Political Equality Club in Rochester, and acting on her social equality principles, Anthony hosted her as a guest in her home. Although Terrell was prominent and well-respected, she regularly described her status and the status of all Black women as inescapably circumscribed by race. A white woman has only one handicap to overcome, that of sex. Colored men have only one, that of race. I have two, both sex and race. I belong to the only group in the country which has two such huge obstacles to surmount. Terrell explained that African American women call ourselves colored not because we are narrow and wish to lay special emphasis on the color of our skin, but because our peculiar status in this country at the present time seems to demand that we stand by ourselves in the special work for which we have organized. The members of the new National Association of Colored Women came together in 1896 with Mary Church Terrell as their president to defend Black womanhood by combating the intersecting forces of sexism and racism. And this is a photo from 1896. And here with the hat with the fruit and the feathers is Mary Church Terrell. Over here on the ground is Ida B. Wells Barnett and her son, Charles Barnett above, who is in the hands of Alice Dunbar Nelson, a writer and activist in her own right. So leading Black club women recognize that the struggle for the vote must extend full citizenship to all African Americans. Voting rights for Black women were always inseparable from questions of Black men's disenfranchisement and the broader Black freedom struggle. Terrell appreciated Anthony's personal warmth, but recognized that Anthony was increasingly ignoring the concerns of African Americans as she led a narrowing of the white suffrage movement's focus from a broader women's rights platform toward the sole goal of gaining national voting rights for white women. Anthony and white suffragists also disrespected other Black suffragists. In 1897, when Adela Hunt Logan, the accomplished lady principal of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, asked Anthony if she could speak at a NACW convention, Anthony replied, I would not, on any account, bring on our platform a woman who had a 10,000th part of a drop of African blood in her veins, who should prove an inferior speaker, because it would militate so against the colored race. Ignoring Logan's accomplishments, Anthony assumed that having an ex-slave at the podium would be a humiliating disaster. Unfortunately, Anthony and other white suffrage leaders focused so narrowly on white women's suffrage that they were willing to sacrifice others to achieve their goal. However disingenuously, Anthony claimed that once women got the right to vote, racial justice would prevail, that any means to get women the vote would hasten the demise of both sexism and racism. At the 1898 National American Women's Suffrage Association convention, a pregnant Mary Church Terrell gave a major speech determined to engage in social justice causes less than 2 months before her due date. Her husband wrote to her father, exclaiming, "She is the only colored woman invited to speak. The other speakers will be women such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frances Willard." After the event, and bursting with pride, he reported back, "Molly immortalized herself last night before the Women's Suffrage Convention. She made a magnificent address in admirable style. The theater was filled with the best men and women of the country, and their reception of Molly's speech amounted to an ovation." To emphasize just how well her speech was received, he wrote that several white women went so far as to hug and kiss her when the meeting closed. White and colored people mounted the stage and fairly took her off her feet. It was indeed the greatest triumph of her life. Referring to segregation and racial barriers, he noted, "When white women publicly embrace a colored woman, you know the reason for it must be strong." This speech and its reception allowed the Terrell couple to take their minds off of her fourth risky pregnancy and focus on their mutual support for women's suffrage. Fortunately, soon after, they welcomed their first healthy living child, a daughter named after the Black Revolutionary era poet, Phyllis Wheatley. Depending upon whether Terrell was addressing a Black or a white audience, she shifted her approach to the subject of women's voting rights. For instance, in her 1906 article in The Voice of the Negro, she assumed that many of her readers would be Black men, and so paid a pointed tribute to Susan B. Anthony soon after her death. Although Terrell did not condone Anthony's move away from advocating for African Americans' rights after the Civil War, she did point to the Reconstruction era betrayal of the Republican Party of white and Black women's goal of universal suffrage as an explanation, but not a justification. Anthony and many other Black and white women had been deeply disappointed when abolitionist men had rejected the goal of universal suffrage in favor of the 14th and 15th Amendments that enfranchised only Black men and not women of either race. In the decades after the Civil War, Susan B. Anthony solicited African American men's support for women's suffrage without granting reciprocal support for their full citizenship rights. Yet, Terrell nonetheless appreciated what Anthony had done for the cause of women's suffrage. Much later, in 1928, for instance, Terrell was the only African-American woman to have her name inscribed on a plaque unveiled at a commemoration of Anthony and the early women's rights movement. Terrell's education and light skin tone gave her some access to white suffragists. She repeatedly tried to engage in an interracial dialogue by networking with and challenging white suffragists, including in more intimate social settings. For instance, in 1910, she wrote in her diary, "I heard Mrs. Ida Harper, the suffragist and biographer of Susan B. Anthony, lecture on the evolution of the women's suffrage movement in an elegant apartment. Wealthy white women were present. When, as Terrell described it, Mrs. Harper criticized colored men for opposing women's suffrage, Terrell forcefully responded to the assembled women, insisting that White men have done the same. After women of the American Revolution helped to free white men from England's tyranny, these same men placed a yoke upon their necks and taxed them without representation, she reminded them. But later, during the reception, when Harper directly asked Terrell if she felt bad about her critique of Black men, Terrell did not want to shut down her access to these white women and the spaces where she could make these challenges, and so she denied that her feelings had been hurt. Regardless of white women's stance, Black suffragists always simultaneously pursued their own voting rights agenda. In 1908, for example, Terrell and other NACW leaders petitioned for a constitutional amendment to extend the vote to all women and asked for protections for Black men's voting rights. One section resolved that we, the members of the Equal Suffrage League, representing the National Association of Colored Women through its suffrage department, in the interest of enfranchisement and taxation with representation, asked to have enacted such legislation as will enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution of our country, the United States of America, throughout all its sections. They wanted Black men to be able to vote. After all, any new women's suffrage amendment would be immediately undermined in the South, just as the Reconstruction amendments had been, unless Congress passed strong and effective enforcement provisions and the relevant government agencies actually enforced them. In addition to public speeches and writings, Mary Church Terrell found more militant and direct suffrage activism appealing. Terrell had long known of and admired the radical techniques employed by British women. For instance, she had recorded in her 1909 diary, "I went to hear Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst, the militant suffragette, and enjoyed her address immensely." Thus, Terrell eagerly joined in a major direct action in the US, the 1913 National Votes for Women Parade. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized this huge suffrage parade for the National American Woman Suffrage Association for March 3rd, 1913, which was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Alice Paul, a young college-educated Quaker, tried at first to exclude Black women in order to pacify Southern white suffragists. Now, I'm going to take some time to describe what really happened for Black women at this march, because it's something that most historians and popular culture have missed. Most historical and popular cultural accounts correctly describe the anti-lynching activist and suffragist Ida B. Wells Barnett's refusal to march in a segregated delegation at the back of the parade, and rightly celebrate her defiant insertion of herself into an otherwise all-white Illinois delegation. What is less well known is that this was not a solitary act of one defiant woman. From what I had learned of Terrell as I was writing my biography, I could not imagine that she had agreed to march segregated at the back, although she must have if Wells Barnett really was the only one who resisted. So I decided to research her participation more carefully. What I found is something that a few Black women's historians had already told us, but that has not been accepted as the real story. Many dozens of Black women, including Terrell, marched all throughout the first suffrage parade in the nation's capital. Those Black suffragists who joined state delegations were at the back, but only because organizers had a carefully choreographed chart for the parade and planned for all the states to assemble there. A Black Chicago newspaper captured the scene that day. The Equal Suffrage Parade was viewed by thousands of people from all parts of the US. No color line existed in any part of it. Afro-American women proudly marched right by the side of the white sisters. Terrell served as a mentor to Howard University's new Delta Sigma Theta sorority, whose members organized to take action in politics and reform movements. Terrell, who wrote the oath for the Deltas and became an honorary lifetime member, negotiated with Alice Paul on their behalf. The members wanted to march together. The key question was whether they would be able to march along with the other contingents of college women. A telegraph from the Suffrage Association to Alice Paul on the day of the parade capitulated to protests from Black women, agreeing that Black suffragists could march without restrictions. Terrell explained that when some of the white suffragists still objected to having the colored girls of Howard University march in the parade, it was Terrell's friend, the lawyer and suffragist Inez Mulholland, who insisted that they be given a place with the pupils of the other schools. Dressed in their caps and gowns, the 25 Howard University Deltas marched alongside the other college delegations, not at the back. Mary Beard, the feminist and progressive US historian, invited Terrell and other NACW members to stride alongside the New York City Women's Suffrage Party, which they did. Black women even carried the state banner for New York and Michigan. As Carrie Clifford's recounted in the NAACP's The Crisis, Black suffragists marched as artists, homemakers, trained nurses, teachers, writers, college graduates, and musicians, among others. An editorial by NAACP leader W.B. Du Bois described the politics surrounding the participation of Black suffragists. The Women's Suffrage Party had a hard time settling the status of Negroes in the Washington parade. Finally, an order went out to segregate them in the parade, but telegrams and protests poured in, and eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance. Du Bois captured the fluidity and chaos of the situation, as well as the resolve of the Black women who organized, protested, and won the capitulation of the white suffragists. If we better understood that Black suffragists collectively fought for and won the right to participate throughout, we would have a different story to tell of Black women's pivotal role in the suffrage movement. Despite their differences, Terrell continued to admire Alice Paul's use of direct action. During World War I, she and her daughter Phyllis, then in her late 20s, were among only a few Black women who are documented as having joined the National Women's Party in peacefully picketing in front of the White House. Carrying banners that called for women's voting rights, Terrell willingly risked arrest and violent attacks. The women who picketed were called traitors for protesting the US government policies during wartime, but persisted nonetheless. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, including on how this story of women's suffrage fits into the larger biography of Mary Church Terrell. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Parker. That was wonderful and a very complex, actually, set of conversations around Mary Church Terrell. I'm from Chicago, so we say Terrell. I've known about her since second grade, which is funny. But I think you all say Terrell, which I get it.
Her family told me it's Terrell, so I had to change my.
Terrell. So that's okay. So that's even that's a Southern way of saying it as well. Well, if you would like to ask questions, we are here. Professor Parker is here to take questions from the audience. We really want you to ask any questions that might be on your mind. You know, I can throw out one if I don't see any, but I definitely think this is a great opportunity to have some Q&A before the panel that we're having shortly thereafter. I know you're out there thinking, so I'll just ask a very quick question. Who would you say are some of the interlocutors of Mary Church Terrell? I'm trying, right? You know, who would you say were her main interlocutors and those folks who had her? Because I often think about who had her political ear, right? Who was in her ear beyond Susan B. Anthony and those folks, but like, who were the folks who she was in conversation with?
She was in conversation with a lot of other Black women who are associated with a kind of early intersectional politics and feminism as well. She was a classmate of Anna Julia Cooper, who was another Black intellectual, also went to Oberlin College, as well as Ida Gibbs Hunt, who was from another very prestigious African-American family and spent time with her husband, who was an ambassador and served abroad. And then as time grew on, she met people like Mary McLeod Bethune and Margaret Murray Washington, and a whole variety of other women. Since she was born enslaved in Memphis, Tennessee. And then that was during the Civil War. So she was only enslaved for 2 years. And then lived in Memphis until she went to school as a young girl in the North, because her parents wanted her to get a better education, and they had set up their own businesses, so were able to pay for her to get an education. And then she lived until 1954. The same year as Brown v. Board of Education. And so this incredibly long life means that she was friends with and collaborated with so many different kinds of activists, because she was literally active for 60 years. So the part that I talked about, I know, so the part that I talked about today is the tedious part of her story, but it's a very interesting part, and it is the part that connects the most with Rochester and Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. She met Frederick Douglass at an inaugural ball for Harrison in the 1870s. And then when she moved to Washington, D.C., they became friends and collaborators, and he was her mentor. So they ended up inviting Ida B. Wells to come and give talks on anti-lynching right after the murder of Thomas Moss and their other friends and collaborators in Memphis. And that was in 1892, 1893. So she only worked with him for the last few years of his life, since Frederick Douglass died in 1895. But she was the one who founded Frederick Douglass Day, the first day to really commemorate him in a public school system. And she did it because, as the quote that you had at the beginning said, he was somebody who supported suffrage from early on. And she really appreciated that he was an intersectional activist as well.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions out here for you. So look, I'm glad we primed, okay? So one of the questions out here is, did Terrell have a relationship with the League of Women Voters?
Yeah, she did. The League of Women Voters was not entirely open to Black women early on. And they've actually taken some responsibility for that more recently and have looked more introspectively at their past. So she wasn't able to fully engage with them, although she would meet their members, because their members were also members of other organizations that she was involved in. She was an active Republican, because like almost all Black women until the 1930s and the New Deal, they were Republicans, as in the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. Right. So if we think about it that way, that's where that came from.
Beautiful. So what did Terrell's suffrage activism look like post the 19th Amendment?
So after the 19th Amendment, she wanted to participate in the National Women's Party that Alice Paul had, in spite of the fact that she knew, or maybe because she knew, that Alice Paul was not going to take Black women's concerns seriously unless they inserted themselves in these organizations. So even as they always had their own organizations, they believed strongly in the need to have organizations that were they needed to join white women whenever they could. So she asked Alice Paul if the National Association of Colored Women could be a member of the National Women's Party. And Alice Paul said no, because she claimed that it was not a party that, or a group that focused on gender and feminism, but on race. So she was completely unable to see intersectionality. And so Alice Paul and Terrell and several other women met together and had this kind of heated exchange. And Terrell was allowed to come as a visiting delegate to talk at the 1921 convention. And she was a lifelong member of the National Women's Party, but she was never able to break through Alice Paul's very singular approach to white women's equality.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Couple more questions out here. We have about 5 more minutes, so it's great. So this is a big question, and maybe I'll couple them together in terms of thinking, how did Terrell and others balance activism, careers, and family life? Like, what support systems did they have? Networks?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, one thing that I tried to allude to by mentioning that her pregnancy that was successful was her 4th, is that she had had a series of tragic situations with late miscarriages, a stillbirth, and then a baby who lived for 2 days, but then died in a segregated DC hospital with an improvised incubator. And she always believed that racism was involved. So kind of like Serena Williams, here you have one of the most elite and fairly well-off white Black woman of her day, who was unable to get good maternity care, right? So she really believed and felt the need to fight for Black women's health and welfare and the health and welfare of their families. So when she became the president of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, she still hadn't had a successful pregnancy. And this was incredibly important to her. So she founded the first kindergartens for Black children and helped create day nurseries, but also advocated for Black women to become nurses and doctors, because she knew what now scientists say is true, that Black doctors and nurses provide better care because they're invested in the health of Black women. So to do all of this work, and once she had her own baby, her mother retired from her career as a hair salon owner and came down from New York, where she was living, to Washington, D.C. to help be a child care provider for their child. And she had a very supportive husband who was equally interesting, Robert H. Terrell, who had been enslaved for the first 7 years of his life, but ended up graduating from Harvard University and getting a law degree from Howard University and becoming the first municipal court judge in Washington, D.C., who was Black. So they were a power couple, and she could not have done what she did without his support, because she was really stepping outside of the boundaries of what Black and white women were expected to be doing. So he did receive pressure, but he was very supportive of her career.
Great. Thank you so much. There's one last question pressing there that I'm sure a lot of folks are asking. And one contributor asked this question, which was, what would you say is the legacy of Mary Church Terrell today? Is it Stacey Abrams? I mean, is it Michelle Obama? Like, where do we find, where do you position the legacy?
Both of those women would be a good place to start, but also Kamala Harris, because one of the things that she was really interested in is Terrell was a political being. And she said if she had lived at a different time, she would have wanted to be a senator. And truthfully, I think she would have wanted to be president. But she was unable to run. And so the best thing that she could find was she ended up working on a white woman's campaign, one of the first white women to win a primary, but she didn't win the election, Ruth Hannah McCormick in 1930. And it took another, I think, 30 30 years for a white woman to win and 60 years for a Black woman to win into the Senate. So she was way before her time. But Kamala Harris, in her acceptance speech, actually mentioned Mary Church Terrell as one of her predecessors who had paved the way for her. So I'd like to make that claim as somebody who we could look to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking time with us to answer these wonderful questions, and thank the audience for these great questions and really being engaged. We now are going to move to our panel discussion, and so I am going to introduce my wonderful colleague, June Wan, who is the director of the Susan B. Anthony Institute of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and also an associate professor of German. My esteemed colleague, June, how are you?
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks, Jeffrey, and thank you, Allison, for sharing your important and fascinating work. So Allison will be joined by our esteemed panelists to talk more about the important role Black women have played in changing the culture and institutions that have perpetuated inequality throughout the United States, the challenges and repercussions they encounter, and the profound resilience they possess in the face of adversity. All in 20 minutes, right? So clearly we're not going to be able to discuss everything, but so let me start by introducing the panelists, and then I will essentially take a step back and let them speak with each other. But you, the audience, is also welcome to ask questions, and I will try to weave them into the conversation. So the first panelist I'm going to introduce is Ananza Benbow. She, class of 2015, who is using her passion for language and issues in education to host the Black Language podcast, featuring conversations about Black people and their languages. Ananza, if you could turn on your camera, please. Thank you. The next panelist is Tiffany Taylor-Smith, class of 1991, a doctoral candidate and assistant vice president for diversity and inclusion at the University of Dayton and co-chair of the University of Rochester's Women's Network. Welcome. And the last panelist is Brianna Theobald, an assistant professor of history here at the University of Rochester. She teaches classes on US women's history and the history of Native America. So maybe just to start off, we can have, I'll just throw out a general question to start the conversation. Thinking about sort of stories like that of Mary Church Terrell, what role does the telling of these stories and of learning about people like Mary Church Terrell have for our current day, and maybe even sort of more personally for you as scholars, as activists? Would anyone like to start?
Well, I'll take it. I think as a scholar and as a practitioner, even just hearing the work and research that Allison has done, which thank you, Allison. Part of it is like, okay, what intrigued you about this project? But that's a sidebar. I want to thank you for your research and your work and sharing of that. And I think for me, as a practitioner in diversity, equity, and inclusion, even in our current climate, it is so important that we learn these stories. I mean, I continue, and I graduated from the university in 1991. I'm a mother of 3 daughters, and I still struggle, and someone who is pursuing a doctorate degree, the stories that were not taught to me as a high school student, as an elementary student, as a someone pursuing her bachelor's degree, unless I took specific courses, and someone who's earned a master's degree and is now pursuing her PhD. It is continuing to be clear to many who choose to acknowledge there are a lot of stories that have been omitted from US history in so many ways. And we're at this moment of truth, this time of somewhat reconciliation, where we have an opportunity, particularly those who are in education, to really look at what are we missing? And to benefit from Allison's work around how do we understand the story and what were the complexities that were involved in the experiences that she had, and trying to move the movement, if you will, for women's suffrage and engage Black women. And you know, often wonder too, as a light-skinned Black woman, how that influenced her ability to be in these spaces. As a light-skinned Black woman, I find myself often puzzled by that as well, the way in which I'm received in different spaces and how that impacts my ability to ally, champion, or be an accomplice for others who are not in those spaces.
Yeah, to add, I feel like as a young Black woman, it's been really important for me to know that since enslavement and perhaps beyond, Black women have always had an analysis of not just race, but where race and gender intersect. And I think that means that for Black people of multiple identities, sexual orientation, ability, class, that there's always been an analysis, an intersectional analysis. And so, sorry, I took some notes on this. And so I just want to make sure I'm getting everything, because I like the way I put it. And so, oh yes, and so it means that like when current generations like myself are silenced or told that we're too sensitive, right? Or told that we're making things up, like we're making up terms and we're making up, identities, where it's like one, all terms and identities are to some, are made up. But two, it's like that just comes from complete ignorance. It comes from lies meant to derail us when we know that we have always existed, right? This work has always existed. And so I think when we hear stories like that, I think for those of us who are doing work, right, with our communities, it's really empowering, right, to know that Black feminism did not start in the 70s, like will often be told to us, right? And that in fact, we've always been doing this work. When I think about Black women doing birth work during enslavement, right? And so like we've always been intersectional about our practices. And so I think for me, when I think about these stories and think about my day-to-day work, in addition to the podcast, I also work at a high school. It's about how am I creating an environment that's safe for my students, that's safe for students with, with multiple identities, and how am I, one, keeping up with the times and knowing how the world is changing, right? So I can be a better advocate for them.
Yeah, so I think that's a great and such an important point to think about, these long legacies of Black women as Black women and other women of color. So my own research is in Indigenous women, Native American women, but so Black women and women of color as theorists, right? Doing in various ways and through experience and so many other things, right? Doing really important theory, have these legacies of important intersectional feminist theory. And then the other thing that I was thinking of is, I think with this, there's this way to get back into Tiffany's point about how histories are told or not told, right? I think that there's this way in which sometimes when we think about activists' histories, that the activists can sort of, it's like they're in the distant past, right? And their lives are somehow just kind of decontextual. I mean, they are like activists, right? And so we get this kind of their public life, some of their public work. And I think what I was thinking about that's really helpful about reading a biography like this, that really gets at the texture of Terrell's life, right? As a full person who's struggling, right, going through all of these real struggles alongside her work, as so many people are. Like that's the reality, right, of activist work and these histories of activist work. And there's a way in which, as I was reading it, there is a way in which I think that looking at one person's life like that in such complexity and depth, and situating her in this evolving historical context, can also serve to remind us in this moment that we are also historical actors, right? In ways that I think sometimes, at least at the kind of student level, we can almost forget, right? That we study history in the past, these women's stories, but you think of so many of the issues, right, with which Terrell engaged. Maternal health, right, and healthcare, educational curriculum, 1619 project, right? How do we understand our histories? police brutality, voting rights, right? I mean, so many of these historical issues are issues that folks are, of course, struggling with today. And I think it's useful to remember that we are historical actors in a historical moment that future generations and future scholars, right, will be analyzing as well.
Yeah, I mean, you all raised such really interesting points. And I do think that when you look at the life of one Black woman in the past, we can learn a lot from that. And one thing that I think is important is this idea of taking people out of one particular moment in their life or one particular action that they're best known for. Like in her case, she's best known as the president of the National Association of Colored Women, but that was actually like one of her earliest acts. And then she had decades and decades of activism after that. And just like Rosa Parks is pretty much known for sitting on the bus, but she was an activist for many decades before that happened. And people aren't aware of her big involvement in the NAACP, although there's been a lot of work now, especially through biographies that have been coming out recently that have tried to help to kind of unpack some of that. And in the case of Terrell, going back to what Tiffany was talking about with her light skin color and privilege and how that played a part for her in getting access to white communities, she was aware of that and she used it to her advantage whenever she could. One of the things that she regularly did is go speak to governors about getting pardons or other ways to try to end death sentences to Black women who were poor and uneducated and very dark-skinned usually, and who were in prison. Some of them were even teenagers with death sentences. And then after she would meet with the governor in the state, whether it was Virginia or whether it was Georgia or other places, she would then go and get access to the women in prison and meet them there. So she wasn't an elite in the sense of elitist, that she wouldn't, she used her power as much as she had it to try to gain access to people and help change their lives. So she was aware of that but was very conscious about it. And the term unceasing militant that I used for the title of the book actually comes from a friend and associate of hers, the actor and activist and singer Paul Robeson, who described her as an unceasing militant in the struggle for Black freedom. And so that was his obituary, in fact, for her when she died. And it seemed to me that it was a really meaningful thing to talk about her as someone who was unceasing in her militancy, which doesn't mean that she also didn't make compromises or go join these meetings with white women that were, somewhat problematic, because she always wanted to be in those spaces to be the voice of dissent. But it does mean that she also worked with communists. And she, when the NAACP decided that it didn't want to take on cases of Black men accused wrongly of rape, like with the Scottsboro 9, she worked with the Communist Party to try to get them freed. So she was really willing to step out of line, if you want to put it that way, and to do direct action like the picketing that she started with the National Women's Party in World War I and continued all the way up to the end when she led a successful campaign to desegregate Washington, D.C. in 1953. So before Montgomery, Alabama, and before Brown v. Board.
Maybe, does anybody have any questions within the panel for each other? I mean, I have some questions as well, but I wanted to give you a chance in case you have something that you would like to ask each other.
One of the things I just wanted to raise, I think is evident in the way that which Allison tells its story, and it's so important in what we see today. Regardless of our identities, even embedded in the story, you see other women there were women who were against her participating because of her race, but there were also women who advocated and allied and championed for her. And even in telling the story, Allison, that you share with us, had those women not stepped up there were certain ways in which she would have been blocked from being able to accomplish what she was able to do. And for me, that raises the question, given our positionality, regardless of our identity, how we advocate for others, whether they be LGBTQ+, Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander identities, as well as Indigenous identities, like how, regardless of our own, how we advocate, ally, and champion, and accomplice in many ways for identities that we don't belong to, how important that is. And I think that that's very transparent in your story, that there were those women and some men who were willing to say, she needs to be a part of this. We need to have them in this space, engaging in the suffrage movement.
Well, and I would just add to that, which I think is a really important point, not maybe regardless of, but also very much because of, right? I mean, I think that the ways we're not something is also important. And I'm saying this as a Korean American who does German Jewish studies, right? The ways in which I'm not German and Jewish are very much about me being Korean American. And so I think when we think about allyship, it is also important to think about not only sort of what the positions are that we're looking at, but where we're positioned within those things, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that you make me think about is this question of being willing to be uncomfortable and to have difficult conversations and to put yourself in with people who are different from you and learn and listen and think about what they're saying and then try to figure out how you want to interact with that. And Terrell did that, but I think a lot of contemporary women have to do the same kind of thing with each other and with others to make this work.
And it's the whole life balance piece for me too. I mean, I didn't know the story about her 4 miscarriage, well, 3, and then the 4th birth of her child. Like, that's the multiple dualities that we carry as women. We're not just these workers, these advocates, these social justice champions. We also have personal lives, and really thinking about, I think that was the piece for me, just understanding the significance of that's not separate. Like, that is a part of who she is. She was living, and thankfully, through the support of her partner, was really able to continue to do the work that she did. So again, that's one of those ones where I appreciate that being a part of the story as well.
I would, in thinking about Tiffany and Tiffany's kind of comments about allyship and really coalition building too, right? And how we think about coalitions, and in thinking about what June said as well. So a lot of, in my research and so my kind of intellectual and some political commitments, right? I'm very interested in reproductive justice, which is a term coined by Black feminists in the 1990s, but that stems out of histories of reproductive oppression, and also long histories of reproductive activism, right, by Black women and Indigenous women and women of color. And one of the things in that literature that I've really noticed as a theme is, because coalitions have been so important to this reproductive justice work. It is a movement kind of based on coalition building, and they talk about this idea of solidarity through difference, right? So that actually, like, the process to kind of June's point of forming these coalitions actually requires some understanding, in at least many of the situations in which they're talking about, of understanding our differences too. And I think so one of the ways that becomes really important is actually understanding the differences in terms of say Indigenous women's relationship, right, to the state, right, and to their tribal nation, and that their goals might be somewhat different, but that there's kind of room for ground if we understand each other. And I think in the work that's come out on suffrage, the historical work that's come out in the last couple of years, right, to commemorate the centennial, I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on the ways in which these different coalitions can actually help to expand the way we even think historically about suffrage, right? For many Black women, it was connected to racial justice. It was a tool, right, for racial justice. Particularly lynching was important for many Native women. it had a lot to do with tribal sovereignty, right, and indigenous cultures. For many Hispanic women, I'm drawing on Kathleen Cahill's work here. For many Spanish-speaking women in the Southwest, right, it was tied to and was a tool for language. And so I think that, like, when we know all of that, thinking about these coalitions that developed are actually in some ways all the more impressive and important to understand, right? Because that we don't get that story if we're just thinking about what, what Rochester's own Sue B, right, how she was conceptualizing all this, and that makes it harder to understand the real coalitions that developed at least at particular points.
What do you all think then about, I was just coming back to where we started this conversation to think about sort of the ways in which we learn these stories, right? And I'm thinking about the ways in which there's sort of, at least in my educational experience, there was sort of African-American history, Asian American history, right? And then white history was sort of the regular history, right? And so that these things are so separated that I think the reason why it's often surprising to learn about these coalitions is because of the way that we're taught these things, or the way that we're sort of taught, or we're trained to sort of categorize these things as this is this type of history, or women's history more generally, right? That women's history is separated from sort of history, which is, male history then, right? So I don't know exactly what the question here is. I guess it would just be, what your thoughts are about ways in which you've seen sort of movements against this, or ways to sort of undermine this particular sort of categorization.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I found useful about doing a biography of a Black woman who lived from 1863 to 1954 is that it was a way to write a different story of American history. And by using her as somebody who I could talk about, there's a whole section on various aspects of her political transformation as African Americans in general move into the Democratic Party, and then also the smearing of all civil rights activists as communists as you move toward World War II and beyond in the Cold War era. And so just every part of this one person's life is also just a way to kind of reframe the history and to think more broadly and in a period of time about what civil rights activism looks like. The civil rights movement often is seen as starting in the 40s or 50s, but if you think about a longer, and other historians have been trying to talk about, how long is the civil rights movement and how far back can we take it? But if you're thinking about it as a Black freedom struggle, you can take it pretty far back. And these women and men in coalition are absolutely doing that. But her work intersects with all kinds of other groups, and she's a pacifist and works with the International Women's League for Women's Peace and Freedom, and travels abroad and actually speaks 5 languages and is fluent in German and French and Italian, and then teaches Latin and Greek. And so she's somebody who has this incredible facility with language, and is the only Black woman who appears as a representative and speaks at several so-called international women's conferences in Europe in the early 20th century. And she pointed out that it was a very bizarre thing to be the only woman of color in a so-called international conference. But what that, I guess, really meant is that it was a European and American women's conference, right? So she tried to insert and think about how can I stand in and be the voice for all of these people who aren't here. So that kind of liminality and the sense that she could try to play that role is an interesting one. But I do think these coalitions are really important.
Well, and this question of language too, right? I'm sort of directing this towards Ananza, but this question of language and about sort of the ways in which, since you are doing a Black language podcast as well, I mean, thinking about language and the ability to use language to sort of mobilize, or the ability to use language to one's advantage, right? And so if you could say maybe something about that as well.
Yeah, I definitely think of it in kind of like two parts, though not separated. But one, it's like, so Professor Parker just mentioned all the languages that Mary Church Terrell spoke, right? And I'm definitely of the camp that used to say Mary Church Terrell. So happy to learn something new today. Right, but it's about speaking languages across our communities, right? And so if I'm thinking specifically about Black women, right, there's Black women all up and down, the Americas and throughout the world who speak different languages, and by and large, many people are going to learn how to speak English as an additional language across the world because it is such, well, the United States has made it so it's a useful language because of the oppression that the United States has caused, right? And so, but it really should be our responsibility to learn the languages of the diaspora, right? So learn the languages that are spoken in the Caribbean, learn the language, of Black women in South America, and thinking about like the Garifuna communities and all the Creoles we have in the Caribbean and the West African languages and languages across the continent that we have in order to build, because the struggle for Black liberation, right, is global. And so that's important. And then I also think about it where it's like language is always changing, and it will always change, and that's what it's always done. And so sometimes I laugh at people who are like such sticklers about like, the English language, and it's like, you can't end a sentence with a preposition. And it's like, well, people do it all the time. It comes out naturally, and it's funny because many things that people will be sticklers about now would be considered, improper and shamed upon, hundreds of years ago, right? And so language is constantly changing. And so the movement and movement building is really a place where people are so creative and expansive when it comes to thinking about language, and we think about new terms that we get. And so when young people are pushing the bounds for what language can do, as older people, we really have to let them do that, right? We have to let them explore their identities and explore how they connect with each other through language. And we can't police that, right? So we can't, police and tell them how to do what they're doing. We kind of just have to watch them and, like I like to do, learn from them, right? Because what they're really doing is moving us to a space that is more inclusive, it's more gender inclusive, right? When young people are able to speak their varieties that aren't standardized English. So we think about, there's so many varieties. And so we think about like African-American language, we think about Chicano English, we think about Appalachian English, like there's so many different types of Englishes across the country and throughout the world. And so when we allow, I was gonna say students, because that's what I work with, but when we allow young people, access and safe spaces to use language comfortably and think about how do they want to use language to represent themselves, I think they build a more inclusive movement or movements. And then I also think about it like language accessibility. And so can people join this space and participate based on the language that they use? And so having sign language interpreters is important. Having interpreters for other languages is also important. And it can't be a situation where it's like, oh, well, nobody who needs sign language interpretation signed up. And it's like, no, we have to provide it and people will come because that is, historically how people have been excluded. They don't see themselves represented and they don't see their languages spoken. And so when we offer that to people, right, then I think we can start to see that community building.
We're almost out of time, unfortunately. So I'm going to ask sort of one final question to each of you, which is all of you in your role, in various roles, and every one of you has multiple roles, are working to change the culture and institutions that have perpetuated inequality by sort of foregrounding the voices of those historically left out of the conversation. And so for those in the audience who are looking to do the same, what advice or sort of last words do you have for this, for them?
I'll go first. I'll take that. I think the big piece of this is, and we've talked about this throughout the theme of this evening, is really being able to listen. I have my story. I have my journey, where I grew up, who I grew up around, where I went to school, what I learned, in my 52 years of life. But it's so important for me to be able to hold my truth, but also be able to listen to others, and to be able to understand that even though their story may be very different than mine, their experiences may be very different, that I can still hold my truth and appreciate theirs as well. And then understanding how I can be an ally, a champion, an accomplice for them as well. And it doesn't have to be an either or, it can be a both and.
For me, I feel like I kind of just said some of this stuff with language, right? And so like more tangibly, right? So when we're hosting events, when we're, having, rallies, and, things like that, right? Having multiple languages available for people. And I mean, what's really nice is like, we are in the community, like multilingual speakers are in the community, right? And so it's not something where you have to like go out and find, in like some directory that's like, and like, I don't know, something that's just like inaccessible. But like there are people, on my block right now who speak tons of languages because I live in New York City. But we do exist everywhere. And then the other thing is a quote kind of spoke to me throughout the presentation. Zora Neale Hurston said it, and it was something like, if you're silent about like your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And the first time I heard that quote, I freaked out because I was like, wow. And I was a student when I heard that, because at the time that I was a student, and actually today's the anniversary that myself and other students from U of R were released from prison in Ferguson, not prison, but we're released from jail in Ferguson during the Ferguson uprisings in 2015. 2014. And so I remember like looking at pictures and images and like kind of seeing everyone's reactions, right? You have some people who are super stoic, you have some people who are really expressive with their face, right? And that's when my friend had said that quote to me. And it's like, we have to be loud, we have to make noise, like, we have to let white supremacy, the state, know that like we are not happy, we're not content with our living conditions. And so when I think about, what can we do in our life, I think it's speaking up at moments when, we notice that there's something wrong, right? And it sounds like simple and cheesy, but I feel like it kind of just starts with that, asking people questions. What did you mean when you said that? Can you explain, what that means? Or, or why would you say that? Or that makes me uncomfortable, right? Because when we let people, right, use their biases throughout healthcare, throughout education, throughout, the different sectors where Black people have to interact. And when we don't check them on what they're doing, right, it just allows it to continue.
So I actually really hesitate to, I mean, I feel like that's like the moment that's like the closing moment, right? But I think I would just kind of echo that. And it also maybe the piece that I might add is I've been thinking about this a lot lately, in part because I've been teaching about a lot of local history and Black women's activism in Rochester. And so I guess I'm thinking about this kind of as connected to place, right? And the beauty of this virtual world, right, is that for better or worse, many of us are in different places right now. But so this is going to be a little bit different depending on where you are. But I mean, I think for those, who are in Rochester, I think that it kind of echoes with what I said before, about being aware of yourself, like as a historical actor, and that would be, this is touching on, a lot of themes, but so, being aware of inequities in our various communities, right, including university communities. There is a long history of Black freedom struggle in Rochester that is very much ongoing, and I think it's just important to be very aware of that and understand this as like connected, this long history. And then I would also note we are also on Haudenosaunee homelands, right? And specifically the homelands of the Seneca Nation. That's another piece of this place, right? And understanding these histories that we need to listen regarding, right? That we need to pay attention to, and that I would suggest be ready to speak out about, right? As Anansa so eloquently said. So I would just leave that with this kind of place-based piece as well.
Yeah, I think these are all really wonderful words of wisdom. And I guess the only thing that I might add is that I think that the life of Mary Church Terrell and other Black women activists really points to the question of persistence and a determination to be militant more than once, and to not give up hope if one action or set of actions doesn't work. And in her case, she did multiple kinds of activism and had meetings with a variety of people, like every day of the week practically. And if one thing didn't work, like if boycotting didn't work, they tried picketing. If picketing didn't work, they tried suing. There's always something. And so I think for young people especially, the notion that we have one summer uprising of 2020 and the world will change might be putting too much hope and effort placed in one moment or one surge, but to realize that it has to be more sustained, and that we have to continue working on these coalitions and on strategies. And that would be what I would take away from it.
Well, thank you all so much for this conversation. Thank you, Allison. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you to the audience as well. There is going to be a slide, I believe, with upcoming events, or I was told there was going to be one. Yeah, there we are. There it is. So please take note of them. And once again, thank you and good night.